In the harsh winter of 1882, when the snow lay 3 feet deep across the Arizona territory, and death stalked both man and beast, a single act of kindness would either forge an unbreakable bond between two peoples or spark a war that would paint the desert red with blood. Samuel McKenna had spent 15 years carving his ranch from the unforgiving wilderness, surviving Apache raids, cattle rustlers, and the brutal elements that claimed weaker men. His prized possession was Thunder, a magnificent black stallion worth more than most men earned in 5 years. But when two Apache sisters arrived at his door, barely alive, and, speaking of a dying child, McKenna faced a choice that would test everything he believed about honor, compassion, and survival in a land where mercy was often rewarded with death. What happened next would become legend, a story whispered around campfires and retold in saloons from Tucson to Santa Fe. For when a morning sun rose over the desert, it would illuminate either the greatest act of courage the territory had ever seen, or the final moments before 200 Apache warriors descended upon a lone ranch house, seeking vengeance for wrongs both real and imagined. This is the true story of how one man's choice in a moment of crisis would forever change the relationship between the Apache Nation and the white settlers of Arizona Territory, a story of sacrifice, honor, and the thin line between civilization and savagery in the American frontier. The wind howled across the Arizona desert like the cry of a wounded animal, carrying with it the promise of death. Samuel McKenna pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders as he made his way from the barn to his small ranch house, the snow crunching beneath his weathered boots. The winter of 1882 had been the harshest in living memory, and McKenna had lived through plenty of harsh winters in his 43 years. The ranch house stood like a lone sentinel against the white expanse, smoke rising from its chimney into the gray sky. McKenna had built it with his own hands 15 years ago, when he first arrived in the territory with nothing but a dream and determination that burned hotter than the desert sun. Every board, every nail, every stone in the foundation represented hours of backbreaking labor and a stubborn refusal to be defeated by the unforgiving land. Inside the barn, Thunder pawed restlessly at his stall. The stallion was magnificent even in the dim light filtering through the gaps in the wooden walls. Standing 17 hands high, his coat was the color of midnight, so black it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His mane flowed like liquid shadow, and his eyes held an intelligence that McKenna had never seen in any other horse. Thunder had been with him for 8 years now, a gift from a grateful Mexican rancher whose daughter McKenna had saved from bandits. The horse was worth more than everything else McKenna owned combined. As McKenna reached for the barn door, he paused. Something was wrong. The usual sounds of the desert night were missing. No coyotes calling in the distance. No wind rustling through the sagebrush. Even Thunder had stopped his restless movement, his ears pricked forward as if listening to something McKenna could not hear. In this land, silence often meant danger. McKenna's hand moved instinctively to the Colt .45 holstered at his hip. He had learned long ago that in the Arizona Territory, a man who relaxed his guard often found himself buried in the very ground he had hoped to tame. The Apache had been quiet for months now, not since the cavalry had driven them back into the mountains after the last raid on the settlements near Tucson. But quiet Indians were often more dangerous than raiding ones. Quiet meant they were planning something. The sound came again, barely audible above the wind. A soft scratching at the front door of the house. McKenna frowned. Wild animals did not scratch at doors, and any human visitor would call out or knock. His grip tightened on his pistol as he moved carefully toward the house, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The scratching continued, weak and irregular. As McKenna drew closer, he realized it was not the sound of claws against wood, but something far more troubling. It was the sound of human fingernails, weakly scraping against the heavy oak door in what seemed like a last desperate attempt to get attention before strength gave out completely. McKenna approached the door from the side, keeping his back to the wall. In the territory, acts of kindness had been used to lure men to their deaths more than once. A wounded woman or child crying for help could be bait for an ambush that would leave a good man dead and his property ransacked. But as he listened more carefully, McKenna's hardened heart began to soften. The scratching was growing weaker, and he could hear something else now. The soft sound of labored breathing, coming in short gasps, as if whoever was outside was fighting just to stay conscious. Against every instinct for self-preservation he had developed over 15 years in hostile territory, McKenna reached for the door handle. His other hand kept his gun drawn and ready. If this was a trap, he would take at least a few of his attackers with him before they brought him down. The door swung open, and McKenna found himself staring down at two young Apache women. They were huddled together against the cold, their traditional clothing inadequate protection against the bitter wind and driving snow. The older of the two, perhaps 20 years old, had her arms wrapped protectively around her companion, who could not have been more than 16. Both were shivering uncontrollably, their lips blue with cold, and their eyes reflecting a desperation that McKenna recognized immediately. These were not warriors preparing for battle. These were people who had pushed themselves beyond the limits of human endurance, and were now facing death in the form of exposure to the elements. The younger girl was barely conscious, her head lolling against her companion's shoulder. Dark stains on their clothing suggested they had been traveling for days, possibly without food or adequate shelter. McKenna's military training and frontier experience screamed at him to be cautious. Apache women could be as deadly as the men when cornered, and this could still be an elaborate ruse designed to get him to lower his guard. But, looking down at the two figures collapsed on his doorstep, he saw something that overrode his caution. He saw suffering that transcended the boundaries of race and culture. He saw two human beings who would die if he did not act. "Easy there," McKenna said in a low, calm voice as he holstered his weapon. The older woman looked up at him with eyes that held a mixture of fear and hope. She tried to speak, but her voice came out as little more than a harsh whisper. McKenna knelt down, making himself less threatening while still maintaining a position from which he could defend himself if necessary. The older woman managed to speak a few words in Apache, then tried broken English. "Help sister, sick child." Her voice faded, and she swayed as if she might collapse. McKenna realized that whatever had brought these two to his door, they were beyond the point of being able to harm him. Their immediate need for help was genuine and desperate. Without further hesitation, McKenna scooped up the younger woman in his arms. She was surprisingly light, her body fragile from hunger and exposure. The older sister struggled to her feet, using the door frame for support. McKenna guided them both inside, kicking the door closed behind them against the howling wind. The warmth of the house hit them like a physical blow. The younger woman stirred slightly in McKenna's arms, and the older one nearly collapsed from relief. McKenna carried the unconscious girl to his bed and gently laid her down, then helped her sister to a chair by the fireplace. He moved quickly, but carefully, adding wood to the fire and stoking it until the flames roared high enough to drive the chill from the room. As the immediate crisis of getting them warm was addressed, McKenna had time to really look at his unexpected guests. Both women bore the distinctive features of the Apache people, with strong cheekbones and dark hair that hung in long braids down their backs. Their clothing was beautifully made, but designed for the desert heat, not the brutal cold of winter. Intricate beadwork decorated their dresses, and silver jewelry caught the firelight when they moved. But it was their condition that concerned McKenna most. Both women showed signs of prolonged hardship. Their faces were gaunt from hunger, and their hands bore cuts and scratches from traveling through rough terrain. The younger woman had a fever that was causing her to mutter incoherently in her unconscious state. Most troubling of all, McKenna could see fear in their eyes that went deeper than simple concern for their physical condition. The older woman, who seemed to be recovering her strength slightly in the warmth of the room, looked up at McKenna with an expression that mixed gratitude with wariness. She spoke again in halting English, her voice stronger now, but still strained with exhaustion. "My name, Ayana," she said slowly, pointing to herself. "Sister, Chenoa." She gestured toward the bed where her younger companion lay unconscious. "We need help. My daughter dying." The words hit McKenna like a physical blow. A child was involved in this desperate situation. Ayana continued speaking, mixing Apache words with broken English, but McKenna was beginning to understand the situation. These women had traveled through the worst winter storm in decades to reach his ranch. They had a sick child somewhere who needed help, and they had come to him as their last hope. McKenna's mind raced as he considered the implications. If these women had family nearby, particularly Apache warriors, his act of kindness in helping them might be viewed as either merciful or suspicious. The Apache were proud people who did not accept charity easily, especially from white settlers. They might see his assistance as an insult that demanded vengeance, or they might view it as evidence of treachery, suspecting that he had somehow harmed the women in the first place. But as McKenna looked at Iona's desperate face and listened to Chinoa's labored breathing, he realized that the political implications of his actions were secondary to the immediate human need before him. These were not enemy warriors or threats to his safety. They were women in distress, and one of them had a child who might die without assistance. Iona struggled to continue her story, her words becoming more coherent as the warmth of the fire restored her strength. Daughter, 3 summers old, fever for many days. Medicine woman, she say need white man's medicine. Say only white man doctor can save her. McKenna nodded slowly, beginning to understand. The Apache had their own healing traditions, but they were practical people who would seek help wherever it might be found when their own methods proved insufficient. The nearest town with a doctor was more than 50 miles away across terrain that would be nearly impossible to traverse in this weather. But these women had attempted the journey anyway, driven by a mother's desperate love for her dying child. "Where is your daughter now?" McKenna asked, his voice gentle but urgent. Every moment they delayed could mean the difference between life and death of the sick child. Iona pointed toward the mountains, visible through the window as dark shadows against the storm clouds. "In sacred place, hidden valley." "Father," he guarded her. "But medicine must come soon," or she did not finish the sentence, but her meaning was clear. McKenna felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside. If the child's father was guarding her in the mountains, that meant there were Apache warriors in the area. The women's arrival at his ranch was not just a desperate plea for help. It was potentially the first move in a much larger and more dangerous game. But as he looked at Chinoa struggling to breathe and saw the tears of desperation in Iona's eyes, McKenna knew that he had already made his choice. Politics and tribal conflicts meant nothing when weighed against the life of a child. He would help them, regardless of the consequences. "What kind of medicine does your daughter need?" McKenna asked. "I have some supplies, but I'm not a doctor." Iona reached into a pouch at her waist and withdrew a crumpled piece of paper. McKenna recognized it as a page torn from a medical book, probably taken during a raid on a settlement. The page described the treatment of fever in children, with particular emphasis on a medicine that McKenna knew was available only in the larger towns. McKenna studied the page carefully, his heart sinking as he realized the magnitude of what the women were asking. The medicine described was indeed effective against childhood fevers, but obtaining it would require a journey of several days through some of the most dangerous territory in Arizona. Even under the best of conditions, such a trip would be difficult and risky. In the middle of winter, with Apache warriors of unknown disposition somewhere in the area, it would be nearly suicidal. But as McKenna looked up from the medical page and saw Iona watching him with eyes that held the last flickering ember of hope, he knew what he had to do. There was one way to get the medicine to the sick child quickly enough to save her life. It would require sacrificing the thing he valued most in the world, but it was the only option that offered any real hope of success. Thunder was the fastest horse in the territory. If anyone could make the journey to town and back in time to save the child's life, it was the magnificent stallion. But sending Thunder meant risking not only the horse's life, but potentially his own, because McKenna knew he would have to make the journey himself. "I can get the medicine," McKenna said quietly, "but it will take time, and I'll need my horse. If your daughter is as sick as you say, every hour counts." Iona nodded eagerly, fresh tears streaming down her face. "Please," she whispered. "She's all I have. Her father. He will do anything to save her." McKenna felt another chill at those words. A father willing to do anything to save his dying child could be either the most grateful ally or the most dangerous enemy, depending on how events unfolded. But McKenna pushed those concerns aside as he began to plan the journey ahead. The storm showed no signs of letting up, but Thunder was strong enough to travel through weather that would stop lesser horses. McKenna had made difficult journeys before, and he knew the trails well enough to travel them, even in poor visibility. If he left before dawn, he could reach town by afternoon, obtain the medicine, and return by the following morning. It would be a hard ride, but it was possible. As McKenna began gathering supplies for the journey, he glanced back at his unexpected guests. Chenoa was sleeping more peacefully now that she was warm, and Ayana was watching the fire with an expression of cautious hope. They had trusted him with their desperate plea for help, traveling across dangerous territory in the worst weather imaginable to reach his door. Now it was time to discover whether that trust had been well placed, and whether his decision to help them would save a child's life or lead to consequences that would echo across the territory for years to come. The first gray light of dawn was still hours away when McKenna finished his preparations for the journey. He had gathered medical supplies from his own stock, packed enough food for several days, and loaded his saddlebags with ammunition and other essentials for traveling through hostile territory. Most importantly, he had studied every detail of the medical page Ayana had shown him, memorizing the exact specifications for the medicine that might save her daughter's life. Thunder sensed the urgency in his master's movements as McKenna led him from the barn into the pre-dawn darkness. The great stallion's breath formed clouds in the frigid air, and his muscles rippled beneath his gleaming coat as he prepared for what he somehow knew would be an extraordinary journey. McKenna ran his hands along Thunder's neck, feeling the power and intelligence that had made the horse legendary throughout the territory. Inside the house, Ayana had recovered enough strength to help care for her sister, who was slowly regaining consciousness. McKenna had left them with food and blankets, along with instructions to keep the fire burning and the doors barred until his return. He knew that leaving two Apache women alone in his house while he traveled to town was a risk that could be misinterpreted by anyone who discovered them there, but the alternative was to abandon them to the storm, which was not an option his conscience would allow. As McKenna prepared to mount Thunder, Ayana appeared in the doorway of the house. She moved carefully across the snow-covered ground, her bare feet protected only by traditional moccasins that were inadequate for the harsh conditions. In her hands, she carried something that caught the faint starlight and gleamed with internal fire. "For the journey," she said in her halting English, extending her hands toward McKenna. In her palms lay a necklace of extraordinary beauty, crafted from silver and turquoise in patterns that told the story of Apache history and tradition. The workmanship was exquisite, representing hours of skilled labor by master craftsmen. McKenna knew immediately that such a piece would be worth a fortune to collectors in the eastern cities, but more importantly, it was clearly a family heirloom of deep spiritual and cultural significance. "I cannot take this," McKenna said, though he was deeply moved by the gesture. "You have already paid me by trusting me with your daughter's life." Ayana shook her head firmly, her eyes reflecting a determination that brooked no argument. "Apache way," she said. "Gift for gift. Life for life. You risk everything for my daughter. You take thunder in a storm for child you do not know. This," she held up the necklace, "this is small payment for such courage." McKenna hesitated, understanding that to refuse the gift would be to insult not only Ayana, but the entire system of honor and reciprocity that governed Apache relationships. Finally, he accepted the necklace, but instead of keeping it, he gently placed it around Ayana's neck. "Hold this for me," he said. "When I return with the medicine for your daughter, when she is well and safe with her family, then you can give it to me as payment for services rendered. Until then, it stays with you as a promise that I will return." Tears formed in Ayana's eyes as she realized the full meaning of McKenna's gesture. By returning the necklace to her, he was making a sacred promise in the Apache tradition. He was binding himself to complete the mission successfully or die in the attempt. It was an act of honor that transcended the racial and cultural barriers that normally separated their peoples. "My father," Ayana began, then stopped, as if weighing whether to share information that might be dangerous. McKenna waited patiently, sensing that whatever she was about to tell him could be crucial to his safe return. "My father is Nate," she said finally, the words coming out in a rush. "War chief of the Chiricahua. He has 200 warriors in the mountains. They wait for word of my daughter." McKenna felt his blood turn to ice water in his veins. Nate was one of the most feared Apache leaders in the territory, a man whose name was spoken in whispers from the army posts to the mining camps. He had led raids that had claimed dozens of lives and had successfully evaded capture by the cavalry for years. If Nate was the child's grandfather, then McKenna was not simply helping a desperate family. He was potentially involving himself in the affairs of one of the most powerful and dangerous men in the Apache nation. "Does he know you came here?" McKenna asked, his voice carefully controlled despite the turmoil in his mind. Iona nodded slowly. He knows. He said if white man helps, he will remember. If white man betrays. She did not finish the sentence, but McKenna understood perfectly. Nate would remember kindness, but he would also remember treachery, and his memory for wrongs done was said to be eternal and unforgiving. The revelation changed everything and nothing. McKenna was now aware that his actions would be observed and judged by one of the most formidable warriors in Apache history, but his commitment to saving the child remained unchanged. If anything, knowing who the child was made his mission more urgent, not less. I will bring the medicine, McKenna said simply. Your daughter will live. As he swung up into Thunder's saddle, McKenna felt the weight of destiny settling around him like a heavy cloak. What had begun as a simple act of mercy for desperate strangers had become something much larger. His actions over the next 2 days would determine not only whether a child lived or died, but potentially the relationship between the Apache Nation and the white settlers of Arizona Territory for years to come. Thunder moved out into the storm with the smooth, powerful gait that had made him famous throughout the territory. The stallion seemed to understand the urgency of their mission, picking his way carefully through the snow-covered terrain while maintaining a pace that would have been impossible for a lesser horse. McKenna sat deep in the saddle, his body moving with Thunder's rhythm as they began their race against time and the elements. The journey to town normally took a full day of hard riding under good conditions. In the storm, with snow obscuring landmarks and wind creating wide-out conditions that could cause a rider to become lost within sight of his destination, it would be a test of both horse and rider that would push them to their absolute limits. As they climbed into the foothills, McKenna became aware that they were not alone in the wilderness. Shadows moved among the rocks and trees, keeping pace with them, but remaining just out of clear sight. Apache scouts were following their progress, probably under orders from Nate to observe what the white rancher would do with his knowledge of the sick child. McKenna made no attempt to lose the watchers or to acknowledge their presence. He understood that they were there to ensure that he was indeed traveling toward town to seek medicine, rather than riding to alert the cavalry about Apache presence in the area. As long as his actions supported his stated intentions, the scouts would remain observers rather than threats. The first test came as they descended toward Willow Creek, normally a gentle stream that posed no obstacle to travelers. The storm had turned the creek into a raging torrent of ice-cold water and debris, flowing too deep and too fast for safe crossing. A normal horse would have balked at the crossing, and a cautious rider would have looked for an alternate route that could add hours to the journey. Thunder approached the flood-swollen creek without hesitation, trusting his rider's judgment completely. McKenna studied the water carefully, looking for the safest crossing point. The current was strongest in the center, but there was a shallow area upstream where rocks created a natural ford that might be passable. Easy, boy, McKenna murmured to Thunder as they entered the icy water. The stallion's powerful muscles bunched as he fought the current, his hooves finding purchase on the rocky bottom. The water rose to his belly, then higher, threatening to sweep them downstream into the chaos of fallen trees and debris that marked the creek's normal channel. For a heart-stopping moment, Thunder lost his footing on the slippery rocks. The current caught him and began pushing him sideways toward the deeper water. McKenna felt the horse struggle beneath him, fighting to regain his balance while the freezing water swirled around them. But Thunder was not just any horse. He was a survivor, a fighter, and he had carried McKenna through dangers before that would have defeated lesser animals. With a surge of power that testified to his incredible strength and determination, Thunder regained his footing and lunged toward the far bank. His hooves struck solid ground, and he scrambled up the muddy slope to safety, water streaming from his coat and ice forming in his mane. McKenna allowed himself a moment of relief before urging Thunder forward again. The crossing had cost them precious time and energy, but they had overcome the first major obstacle in their path. Behind them, McKenna caught a glimpse of Apache scouts watching from the trees, their faces showing respect for both horse and rider who had successfully navigated the dangerous crossing. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the storm intensified rather than abating. Snow fell so thickly that visibility dropped to mere yards, and the wind howled with a ferocity that seemed designed to drive all living things to shelter. But McKenna pressed on, guided by an internal compass developed through years of traveling the territory's dangerous trails. Thunder never faltered, his powerful stride eating up the miles despite the increasingly difficult conditions. The stallion's coat steamed in the cold air, but his breathing remained steady and strong. McKenna knew that he was asking more of the horse than any reasonable person should, but he also knew that Thunder was capable of extraordinary efforts when the situation demanded them. The second major challenge came as they approached Eagle Pass, a narrow route through the mountains that was treacherous even under good conditions. In the storm, with ice coating the rocky trail and wind threatening to blow horse and rider off the narrow ledges, it was potentially suicidal. But it was also the only route that would get them to town in time to save the child's life. McKenna dismounted and led Thunder into the pass on foot, knowing that the horse would need all of his concentration to navigate the icy footing. The trail was barely wide enough for a horse and rider, with a sheer cliff rising on one side and a drop of hundreds of feet on the other. Ice had formed on every surface, creating conditions that would challenge even the most sure-footed mountain goat. Step by careful step, they made their way through the pass. Thunder followed McKenna's lead with absolute trust, placing his hooves exactly where his master's boots had found secure footing. Several times, the stallion slipped on the icy rocks, but each time he recovered his balance with the grace and skill of a natural athlete. Halfway through the pass, disaster struck. A gust of wind stronger than anything they had yet encountered caught them on an exposed section of trail. McKenna felt himself being pushed toward the edge of the cliff, his boots sliding on the ice-covered rocks. Thunder, sensing his master's danger, lunged forward and caught McKenna's coat in his teeth, pulling him back from the brink just as the rancher's feet went out from under him completely. For a moment, McKenna hung suspended over the abyss, held only by Thunder's powerful jaws gripping his coat. Then, the stallion backed carefully away from the edge, setting McKenna down on solid ground with the gentle precision of a mother cat moving her kittens. "Good boy," McKenna gasped, his heart pounding as he realized how close he had come to death. Thunder nickered softly in response, as if to say that saving his master's life was simply part of the job. They completed the passage through Eagle Pass just as the storm reached its peak intensity. Snow was falling so heavily that it was almost impossible to see, and the wind created drifts that threatened to block the trail completely. But they had made it through the most dangerous part of the journey, and the town lay only a few hours ahead. As they descended toward the valley where the settlement of Clearwater stood, McKenna allowed himself to think about the child they were racing to save. He had never seen her, did not even know her name, but she had become the center of his universe for these past hours. Everything he was risking, all the dangers he was facing, all came down to saving the life of one small Apache girl who trusted her mother and grandfather to find help when their own healing methods proved insufficient. The lights of Clearwater appeared through the storm like beacons of hope. The small town was huddled in a valley, its buildings dark except for the glow of oil lamps and fireplaces that spoke of human habitation and civilized comfort. But McKenna knew that his arrival would create complications as well as opportunities. Clearwater was a settlement that existed in an uneasy truce with the Apache people. There had been no major raids in the area for months, but tensions remained high, and the sight of a storm-soaked rancher demanding medicine for Apache children would certainly raise questions and suspicions. McKenna would have to be very careful about how he explained his mission if he wanted to avoid creating problems that could endanger not only himself, but also the family he was trying to help. As Thunder carried him down the final slope toward the town, McKenna found himself thinking about the watchers he knew were still following him through the storm. Apache scouts who served Nate would be observing his every move, ready to report back to their war chief about the white man's actions. If McKenna succeeded in obtaining the medicine and returning safely, he might earn the respect and friendship of one of the most powerful Apache leaders. If he failed, or if his actions were perceived as treacherous, he could find himself facing the wrath of 200 of the finest warriors in the territory. But as Thunder's hooves struck the hard-packed earth of Clearwater's main street, McKenna pushed those concerns aside. He had not traveled through the worst storm in memory, and risked his life in Eagle Pass to worry about political consequences now. He had come to save a child's life, and that was exactly what he intended to do. The main street of Clearwater was eerily quiet as Thunder's hooves echoed off the frozen ground. Most of the town's residents had wisely chosen to remain indoors during the storm, but McKenna could see faces peering through frost-covered windows as word of his arrival spread from house to house. A lone rider traveling in such weather was unusual enough to warrant curiosity, and McKenna's ice-crusted appearance made it clear that he had endured a journey that most would not have attempted under any circumstances. Dr. Harrison Whitmore's office stood at the end of the street, identified by a simple wooden sign that had weathered countless seasons in the harsh Arizona climate. McKenna had met Whitmore several times over the years, mostly for treatment of injuries suffered during ranch work or the occasional clash with hostile elements in the territory. The doctor was a competent medical man who had come west after losing his practice in Philadelphia to gambling debts, but he had proven himself reliable and skilled in the frontier conditions that tested every man's character. McKenna tied Thunder to the hitching post outside the doctor's office, taking a moment to check the stallion's condition after their grueling journey. Thunder was breathing heavily, and his coat was matted with sweat despite the cold, but his eyes remained bright and alert. The horse had given everything he had to make the journey, but he was far from exhausted. McKenna knew that the return trip would be just as demanding, and possibly more dangerous if the storm continued to worsen. The door to the doctor's office opened before McKenna could knock, revealing Dr. Whitmore holding an oil lamp that cast wavering shadows across his lined face. The physician was a man in his 50s with gray hair and the steady hands that came from years of dealing with medical emergencies under less than ideal conditions. His eyes took in McKenna's ice-covered clothing and obvious exhaustion with professional assessment. "Don't like idea," Whitmore said, stepping aside to allow the rancher entry. "You look like you've been through hell and back. What brings you out in weather that would keep a mountain man by his fire?" McKenna entered the warm office gratefully, feeling sensation return to his numbed hands and feet as the heat from the doctor's stove began to thaw his frozen extremities. The office was simple but well-organized, with medical supplies arranged neatly on shelves and examination table positioned to take advantage of the light from the room's single window. The smell of carbolic acid and other medical preparations filled the air, creating an atmosphere of professional competence that was reassuring after the dangers of the journey. "I need medicine, Doc," McKenna said without preamble. "A child's life depends on it, and I don't have time for lengthy explanations." He pulled out the crumpled medical page that Ayanna had given him, smoothing it carefully before handing it to the physician. "This describes what I need. The child has had a fever for days, and it's getting worse. Dr. Whitmore examined the page carefully, his professional demeanor sharpening as he recognized the symptoms described in the text. "This is serious," he said after a moment. "The fever pattern described here suggests a dangerous infection that could be fatal if not treated promptly. The medicine mentioned in this text is effective, but it's also expensive, and I don't keep large quantities in stock." McKenna reached into his coat and withdrew a leather pouch containing every dollar he had saved over the past 2 years. The money represented countless hours of backbreaking labor, careful management of his small herd of cattle, and the profits from selling horses he had trained with painstaking care. It was his emergency fund, his insurance against the disasters that could destroy a rancher's livelihood in a single day. "How much?" McKenna asked, setting the pouch on the doctor's desk with a soft thud that spoke of substantial weight. Dr. Whitmore picked up the pouch and hefted it thoughtfully, then set it down without opening it. "Sam, this medicine costs more than most men in this territory earn in 6 months. And even if you have enough money, I have to ask some questions before I can provide it. Whose child are we talking about? Where are the parents? Why isn't the family here requesting treatment directly?" McKenna had anticipated these questions, but that did not make them any easier to answer. The truth was complicated and potentially dangerous for everyone involved. If he revealed that he was seeking medicine for Nature's granddaughter, it could create panic in the town and possibly lead to military intervention that would endanger the very child he was trying to save. But lying to Dr. Whitmore would be both dishonorable and ultimately pointless, since the truth would likely emerge eventually anyway. "The child is Apache," McKenna said quietly. "Her family came to my ranch seeking help. Their own medicine has failed, and the child will die without proper treatment. I gave my word that I would bring back what's needed to save her life." Dr. Whitmore's expression grew troubled as he absorbed the implications of McKenna's words. The relationship between the town and the Apache was complex and often tense, marked by periods of relative peace, punctuated by outbreaks of violence that left both sides nursing grievances and suspicions. Providing medicine to Apache children was not illegal, but it was certainly politically sensitive, especially given the ongoing military efforts to control Apache movements throughout the territory. Sam, I took an oath to heal the sick regardless of who they are, Dr. Whitmore said slowly. But you also know that helping Apache families has been used as evidence of collaboration by some people in this territory. If word gets out that I provided medicine for Apache children, it could cause serious problems for both of us. McKenna understood the doctor's concerns, but he also knew that time was running out for the sick child. Every moment they spent discussing the political implications of their actions was a moment closer to the point where no medicine would be sufficient to save the little girl's life. Doc, there's a 3-year-old child who's burning up with fever while we stand here talking about politics, McKenna said, his voice carrying an edge of desperation that he could not entirely conceal. I'm not asking you to make a public statement or take a political stand. I'm asking you to give me medicine that will save a dying child's life. Everything else can be worked out later. Dr. Whitmore studied McKenna's face for a long moment, seeing something there that convinced him of the rancher's sincerity and the urgency of the situation. Finally, he nodded and moved to his medicine cabinet, withdrawing a small vial of liquid that seemed almost insignificant considering the effort and risk involved in obtaining it. This is enough for a child of 3 years, Dr. Whitmore said as he prepared a small package containing the medicine along with detailed instructions for its administration. The dosage is critical. Too little, and it won't work. Too much, and it could be dangerous. Make sure whoever gives it to the child follows these directions exactly. McKenna accepted the package with hands that trembled slightly from relief and exhaustion. The small vial represented hope for a family that had trusted him with their most precious possession. It also represented the completion of the most difficult part of his mission, though he knew that the return journey would present its own challenges. Thank you, Doc, McKenna said as he counted out the money for the medicine. The cost was indeed substantial, representing a significant portion of his savings, but he paid it without hesitation or regret. Some things were more important than money, and saving a child's life was definitely one of them. As McKenna prepared to leave the doctor's office, Dr. Whitmore caught his arm. Sam, be careful on the way back. The storm's getting worse, and there are reports of increased Apache activity in the mountains. Some of the cavalry patrols have been asking questions about unusual movements in the area. The warning sent a chill through McKenna that had nothing to do with the weather outside. If military patrols were investigating Apache activities, it meant that nature's presence in the mountains was becoming known to the authorities. The delicate situation surrounding the sick child could quickly escalate into a military confrontation that would endanger everyone involved. I'll be careful, Doc, McKenna said, and if anyone asks, you never saw me tonight. Dr. Whitmore nodded grimly, understanding the need for discretion in a situation that was rapidly becoming more complex and dangerous than either man had initially realized. McKenna stepped back into the storm to find that the weather had indeed worsened during his time in the doctor's office. The wind was now strong enough to knock a man off his feet, and the snow was falling in sheets that made visibility nearly impossible. Thunder stood exactly where McKenna had left him, ice forming on his mane, but his posture alert and ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. As McKenna prepared to mount the stallion for the return journey, he became aware of unusual activity on the edge of town. Dark figures moved through the storm, their movements too purposeful and coordinated to be ordinary travelers seeking shelter. Apache scouts had followed him to Clearwater, and they were now positioned to observe his departure and ensure that he was indeed carrying medicine back toward the mountains. The presence of the scouts was both reassuring and ominous. It meant that Nate was taking no chances with his granddaughter's welfare, maintaining surveillance to ensure that the white rancher honored his commitment to help. But it also meant that any failure on McKenna's part would be immediately reported, with potentially fatal consequences for everyone involved. McKenna swung up into Thunder's saddle and turned the stallion's head toward the mountains. The return journey would be even more difficult than the trip to town, as they would be traveling uphill through worsening weather conditions. But they now carried the precious medicine that could save a child's life, and that knowledge gave both horse and rider the motivation they needed to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As they left Clearwater behind, McKenna caught glimpses of the Apache scouts melting back into the storm, maintaining their protective watch while remaining invisible to any potential threats. Their presence was a reminder that his actions were being observed and judged by people whose respect was not easily earned but whose enmity could be deadly. The journey back to the ranch tested every limit of endurance that McKenna and Thunder possessed. The storm had transformed familiar landmarks into alien shapes, and several times they found themselves temporarily lost in terrain that McKenna had traveled hundreds of times before. But Thunder seemed to possess an internal compass that guided them through the confusion, his instincts proving more reliable than human navigation in the blinding conditions. The most dangerous moment came as they climbed through Eagle Pass for the second time. Ice had continued to accumulate on the narrow trail, and the wind had grown strong enough to threaten their balance even on the relatively protected sections of the route. McKenna again dismounted and led Thunder through the treacherous passage, but this time their exhaustion made every step more precarious than it had been on the outward journey. Halfway through the pass, Thunder slipped on a patch of ice and went down heavily on his front knees. For a terrifying moment, McKenna thought the stallion might be injured, which would doom both of them to death in the mountains. But Thunder struggled back to his feet with characteristic determination, showing only minor scrapes that would not impair his ability to continue. As they finally cleared Eagle Pass and began the descent toward McKenna's ranch, the first light of dawn was beginning to penetrate the storm clouds. They had been traveling for nearly 24 hours, pushing themselves and each other beyond normal limits in their race to save the Apache child's life. But they had succeeded in obtaining the medicine, and they were now within hours of completing their mission. The sight of the ranch buildings appearing through the storm filled McKenna with relief that went deeper than simple gratitude for shelter and warmth. He had kept his promise to Ayana and her family. He had risked everything to bring back the medicine that might save a dying child, and he had done so despite political complications that could have serious consequences for his future in the territory. As Thunder carried him down the final slope toward home, McKenna found himself thinking about what would happen after they delivered the medicine to the Apache family. Would Nate honor the implicit agreement that had brought his daughter and granddaughter to McKenna's door seeking help? Would the successful completion of this mission create a bond of respect and understanding between the Apache war chief and the white rancher? Or would it simply mark the end of a temporary truce that would give way to the normal hostilities that characterized relationships between their peoples? McKenna did not know the answers to these questions, but he knew that he had done the right thing regardless of the consequences. Some actions were justified by their inherent moral value rather than their practical outcomes, and saving a child's life was definitely one of those actions. As Thunder's hooves struck the familiar ground of McKenna's ranch yard, the rancher felt a deep satisfaction that came not from the completion of a dangerous mission, but from a knowledge that he had lived up to the highest standards of human decency in a situation that tested every aspect of his character and courage. McKenna's hands trembled as he dismounted from Thunder, the exhaustion of their grueling journey finally beginning to take its toll. The stallion stood with his head lowered, sides heaving, steam rising from his coat in the frigid morning air. Ice crystals had formed in his mane and tail, and his legs were caked with mud and snow from the treacherous mountain trails. Despite his obvious fatigue, Thunder's eyes remained alert, as if he understood that their mission was not yet complete. The ranch house stood before them unchanged, smoke rising steadily from the chimney into the gray dawn sky. But as McKenna approached the door, he sensed a tension in the air that had not been present when he departed. The Apache women were waiting for him, but they were not alone. Dark shapes moved among the rocks and trees surrounding the ranch buildings, and McKenna realized that during his absence, the situation had evolved in ways that could prove either promising or deadly. Ayana met him at the door, her face a mixture of desperate hope and barely controlled anxiety. Behind her, Chenoa had recovered enough strength to sit up, though she remained obviously weak from their ordeal in the storm. But it was the presence of the third figure in the room that caused McKenna's hand to instinctively move toward his gun. An Apache warrior stood near the fireplace, his powerful frame and weathered face marking him as a man accustomed to command and respect. He wore traditional clothing decorated with intricate beadwork, and his long hair was adorned with feathers that indicated his high rank within the tribal hierarchy. Most significantly, He carried himself with a quiet dignity and suppressed violence that McKenna had learned to associate with Apache war chiefs. "Nate," McKenna said quietly, recognizing the legendary figure despite having never seen him before. The Apache leader's reputation preceded him throughout the territory, where his name was spoken with equal measures of respect and fear by both soldiers and civilians. The war chief studied McKenna with eyes that seemed to look directly into his soul, evaluating everything about the white rancher from his travel-stained clothes to the medicine package clutched in his frostbitten hands. When Nate finally spoke, his voice carried the authority of a man who had led warriors into battle against overwhelming odds and survived to tell the tale. "You have traveled far in the storm," Nate observed in English that was accented but perfectly clear. "My daughter tells me you risked your life to bring medicine for my granddaughter." "This is true." McKenna held up the package containing the precious vial and the detailed instructions from Dr. Whitmore. "It's true. This medicine should break her fever and save her life if it's administered according to these directions." Nate accepted the package with hands that showed the calluses and scars of a lifetime spent in warfare and survival. He examined the vial carefully, then read through Dr. Whitmore's instructions with the concentration of a man who understood that his granddaughter's life hung in the balance of every detail. "This white medicine," Nate said after completing his examination. "You believe it will work where Apache healing has failed?" The question carried deeper implications than simple medical curiosity. McKenna understood that he was being asked to validate the effectiveness of white man's medicine over traditional Apache healing practices, a subject that touched on issues of cultural pride and dignity that went far beyond the immediate medical emergency. "Your healing methods are proven and respected," McKenna said carefully, "but sometimes different illnesses require different treatments. This medicine has been effective against the type of fever your granddaughter is suffering from. It's not better than Apache medicine, just different." Nate nodded slowly, appreciating McKenna's diplomatic answer that acknowledged Apache medical traditions while advocating for the use of the white man's cure. The war chief's expression suggested that he was beginning to understand why his daughter had chosen to seek help from this particular white man rather than from others in the territory. "My granddaughter waits in the sacred valley," Nate said. "The journey is difficult, but not impossible for a man who has already proven his courage in the storm. Will you come with us to ensure that this medicine is used correctly?" The invitation was both an honor and a test. By asking McKenna to accompany them to the hidden valley where the sick child waited, Nate was offering him a level of trust that was rarely extended to outsiders. Apache's sacred places were closely guarded secrets, and the location of the hidden valley would be valuable intelligence for any military forces seeking to track down the war chief and his followers. But the invitation was also a test of McKenna's true motives. If he was genuinely concerned about the child's welfare, he would want to ensure that the medicine was administered properly. If he was secretly working with military authorities or had other ulterior motives, the invitation to visit an Apache stronghold would force him to reveal his true loyalties. "I'll come," McKenna said without hesitation. "The doctor's instructions are specific about the dosage and timing. If something goes wrong with the treatment, you'll want someone there who understands the white man's medicine." Nature's stern expression softened slightly, the first sign of approval that McKenna had seen from the formidable war chief. "You understand the risk you take? The sacred valley is protected by my warriors. Any white man who enters and then betrays its location will not leave alive." McKenna met Nature's gaze steadily, understanding that this was not a threat but simply a statement of fact. Apache justice was swift and final for those who violated their trust, especially when it came to the safety of their most sacred places. "I understand," McKenna replied. "The location of your valley will remain secret. You have my word on that." Nate studied McKenna for another long moment, then nodded once in acceptance. The compact was sealed with that simple gesture, binding both men to an agreement that transcended the normal hostilities between their peoples. As preparations for the journey to the sacred valley began, McKenna became fully aware of the extraordinary nature of what was happening. Apache warriors emerged from their concealment around the ranch, revealing that his property had been surrounded by nearly 50 of Nature's finest fighters. They moved with the fluid grace of men who had spent their lives in the saddle and on foot across the most challenging terrain in the American Southwest. The warriors showed no hostility toward McKenna, but neither did they display friendship. They watched him with the professional assessment of soldiers evaluating a potential ally or enemy. McKenna understood that his acceptance by Nate meant something to these men, but it did not automatically earn their trust or respect. Those would have to be demonstrated through his actions in the hours ahead. Thunder was provided with feed and water, but McKenna knew that the stallion would not be coming on the journey to the Sacred Valley. Apache horses were smaller and more agile than Thunder, better suited for the narrow mountain trails that led to their hidden stronghold. McKenna felt a moment of regret at leaving his faithful companion behind, but he also knew that Thunder had already given everything he had to make their mission possible. Ayana and Chenoa would also remain at the ranch, since Chenoa was still too weak to travel and Ayana needed to care for her sister. This meant that McKenna would be traveling into Apache territory accompanied only by Nate and his warriors, with no other white faces to provide even the illusion of familiar companionship. The horse provided for McKenna was a tough Apache pony that regarded him with intelligent eyes and obvious skepticism. The animal was clearly accustomed to Apache riders and would need to be convinced that this white stranger deserved its cooperation. McKenna took time to let the horse become familiar with his scent and voice, understanding that building trust with his mount could be crucial if emergency situations arose during their journey. As the war party prepared to depart, Nate approached McKenna with something that glinted in the pale morning light. It was a band of silver decorated with traditional Apache symbols, clearly a piece of significant ceremonial importance. "You wear this while you travel with us," Nate said, handing the silver band to McKenna. "It marks you as under my protection. Any Apache who sees it will know that you are not to be harmed while you serve my family." McKenna accepted the silver band with appropriate gravity, understanding that it represented both protection and responsibility. As long as he wore it, he would be safe from Apache violence, but he would also be expected to conduct himself in a manner that reflected honor upon Nature's reputation. The journey to the Sacred Valley began as the sun broke through the storm cloud for the first time in days. The Apache warriors moved through the mountain terrain with an efficiency that amazed McKenna, following trails that he could barely see and navigating obstacles that would have stopped most cavalry patrols. Their knowledge of the land was encyclopedic, encompassing not only the location of every water source and shelter, but also the seasonal patterns of wildlife and the best defensive positions for repelling attacks. As they climbed higher into the mountains, McKenna began to understand why the Apache had been able to resist military subjugation for so long. The terrain itself was their ally, providing countless hiding places and escape routes that would be unknown to outsiders. Even with Apache guides, the journey was challenging enough to discourage pursuit by any force that lacked both exceptional determination and extensive local knowledge. The Sacred Valley revealed itself gradually as they crested a ridge that seemed to lead nowhere. What appeared from below to be solid rock face was actually a narrow passage that wound between towering cliffs for several hundred yards before opening into a hidden paradise that took McKenna's breath away. The valley was roughly circular, perhaps 2 miles across, with steep walls that provided natural protection from observation or attack. A crystal-clear stream ran through its center, fed by springs that emerged from the rocks at the base of the encircling cliffs. Grass grew thick and green despite the winter season, nourished by the water and protected from the harsh weather by the sheltering stone walls. But what truly made the valley sacred was not its natural beauty, but the evidence of Apache presence that dated back countless generations. Petroglyphs covered sections of the cliff walls, telling stories of hunts and battles and spiritual visions that stretched back to the beginning of Apache memory. Carefully tended gardens showed where medicinal plants were cultivated using knowledge passed down through centuries of tribal tradition. Near the center of the valley stood a traditional Apache shelter that had been constructed with particular care and attention to ceremonial detail. McKenna could see smoke rising from its interior, and he knew that this was where Nature's granddaughter lay fighting for her life while her family waited to see whether white man's medicine could succeed where Apache healing had reached its limits. As they approached the shelter, McKenna felt the weight of responsibility settling upon him like a physical burden. Everything he had risked, all the dangers he had faced, all the trust that had been placed in him by desperate parents and a powerful war chief, would be tested in the next few hours. The medicine in his pack represented hope for a dying child, but it also represented the possibility of failure that could have consequences far beyond the loss of a single life. Nate dismounted near the shelter and gestured for McKenna to follow. As they approached the entrance, McKenna could hear the sound that had driven a desperate mother to travel through the worst storm in memory to seek help from a stranger. It was the labored breathing of a very sick child, punctuated by the soft murmurs of women's voices speaking in Apache as they maintained their vigil beside the little girl's bedside. The moment of truth had arrived, and McKenna knew that the next few hours would determine not only whether he had succeeded in saving a child's life, but whether his actions would create a lasting bond of respect between two cultures that had been locked in conflict for generations. Inside the shelter, McKenna found himself in the presence of the most important and nerve-wracking patient of his life. The sick child lay on a bed of soft furs, her small face flushed with fever and her breathing rapid and shallow. She could not have been more than 3 years old, just as Ayanna had said, with the delicate features and dark hair that marked her as unmistakably Apache. But what struck McKenna most powerfully was how fragile and vulnerable she appeared, this little girl whose illness had set in motion events that brought together a desperate family, a war chief's warriors, and a white rancher in the most unlikely alliance the territory had ever seen. Beside the child sat 2 Apache women whom McKenna recognized as experienced healers from the ceremonial items arranged around them. They had been maintaining a constant vigil, using traditional methods to fight the fever that threatened to claim the little girl's life. Sage burned in a small brazier, filling the shelter with aromatic smoke that was believed to have purifying properties. Various herbs and roots lay prepared for use, representing generations of accumulated knowledge about healing and the delicate balance between life and death. The women looked up as Nate and McKenna entered, their faces showing the strain of sleepless nights spent fighting a battle they were gradually losing. They moved aside respectfully to make room for the white man who had brought the medicine that might succeed where their own efforts had fallen short, but McKenna could see wariness in their eyes. They were allowing him to try his white man's cure, but they were also ready to resume their traditional healing methods if his medicine proved ineffective. McKenna knelt beside the child and carefully examined her condition, using the knowledge he had gained from years of treating sick animals and the basic medical training that came from living in a place where the nearest doctor was often days away. The little girl's skin was burning hot to the touch, and her pulse was rapid and weak. Her eyes moved restlessly beneath closed lids, and occasionally she murmured words in Apache that suggested she was experiencing the fevered dreams that often accompanied serious illness. "Her name is Ayanna," Nate said quietly, using the same name as his daughter. "In our language, it means eternal blossom. She is the light of our family, the hope for our future." The weight of that statement settled upon McKenna as he carefully withdrew the medicine from Dr. Whitmore's package. The vial seemed impossibly small to contain the hope of an entire family, but he had seen the effectiveness of white man's medicine before, and he knew that sometimes the most powerful remedies came in tiny doses. Following Dr. Whitmore's instructions exactly, McKenna measured out the precise amount of medicine needed for a child of little Ayanna's size and age. The dosage was critical, as the doctor had emphasized. Too little would be ineffective against the serious infection that was causing the fever. Too much could be dangerous or even fatal to a small child whose body was already weakened by days of illness. The Apache healers watched intently as McKenna prepared the medicine, their professional interest overcoming any cultural barriers that might normally prevent them from observing white medical practices. They asked careful questions about the composition and intended effects of the medicine, demonstrating that their concern for the child transcended any prejudices they might have about foreign healing methods. "This medicine fights the spirits that cause fever," McKenna explained, choosing words that would make sense within the Apache understanding of illness and healing. "It will help her body grow stronger so that her own spirit can drive away the sickness." One of the healers nodded thoughtfully, appreciating McKenna's respectful approach to explaining his methods in terms that acknowledged rather than dismissed their own medical traditions. The woman reached into her collection of herbs and withdrew several leaves that McKenna recognized as having properties that would complement rather than interfere with the white man's medicine. "These will help the child's stomach accept the strange medicine," she said, crushing the leaves to release their natural oils. And these will strengthen her spirit while the white medicine fights the fever spirits. The collaboration between traditional Apache healing and modern medical treatment created an atmosphere of mutual respect that McKenna found deeply moving. These women were not abandoning their own healing traditions in favor of his medicine. Instead, they were incorporating it into a comprehensive treatment approach that drew upon the best of both medical systems. Little Ayana stirred restlessly as McKenna gently lifted her head to administer the medicine. Her eyes opened briefly, and for a moment she looked directly at him with a startling clarity that sometimes emerged even in seriously ill children. She seemed to recognize that this strange white man was there to help her, and she cooperated as he carefully gave her the medicine followed by the prepared herbs that would help her body accept the foreign treatment. "Now we wait," McKenna said, settling back on his heels as the immediate crisis of administering the medicine passed. The doctor said it should begin working within a few hours, but the full effect might not be seen for a day or more. Nate nodded grimly, understanding that they had reached the point where human effort gave way to hope and prayer. All the risks that had been taken, all the trust that had been extended, all the barriers that had been crossed between two cultures, now came down to waiting to see whether a small vial of white man's medicine could save the life of one Apache child. As the hours passed, the shelter became a place where time seemed suspended between hope and despair. The Apache healers maintained their traditional treatments, burning sage and administering herbal remedies that complemented the white medicine. Nate sat in stoic silence, but McKenna could see the terrible tension in the war chief's posture as he watched his granddaughter fighting for her life. McKenna found himself thinking about the chain of events that had brought them all to this moment. If Ayana and Chenoa had not been desperate enough to risk traveling through the worst storm in memory, if they had not chosen to seek help at his ranch, if he had not been willing to risk everything to obtain the medicine, little Ayana would already be dead. But even now, success was not guaranteed. The medicine might prove ineffective, or it might have been administered too late to save the child's life. As the afternoon sun filtered through the smoke hole in the shelter's roof, McKenna noticed the first signs of change in little Ayana's condition. Her breathing seemed to be growing less labored, and her restless movement had diminished into what appeared to be more natural sleep. Most encouraging of all, her skin felt slightly less burning to the touch when McKenna carefully checked her temperature. The Apache healers noticed the changes as well, their professional experience allowing them to detect subtle improvements that might have been missed by less trained observers. They exchanged meaningful looks and spoke quietly in Apache, their voices carrying the first notes of cautious optimism that had been heard in the shelter for days. "The fever spirits are weakening," one of the healers announced after completing a traditional examination that involved checking the child's pulse points and observing the color of her skin and the moisture in her mouth. "The white medicine and our herbs are working together to drive away the sickness." By evening, the improvement in little Ayana's condition was unmistakable. Her fever had broken, leaving her skin cool and moist instead of burning hot. Her breathing had returned to the normal pattern of healthy sleep, and when she briefly woke to drink water, her eyes were clear and focused rather than clouded with fever and delirium. Nature's relief was profound but carefully controlled, reflecting the stoic dignity that was expected of an Apache war chief, even in moments of personal triumph. He placed a gentle hand on his granddaughter's forehead, feeling for himself the absence of the fever that had threatened to take her from the world. When he looked up at McKenna, his eyes reflected a gratitude that went deeper than words could express. "You have given my granddaughter back her life," Nate said simply. "This is a debt that cannot be repaid with silver or horses or any material gift. It is a debt of the spirit that binds our families together for all generations to come." McKenna understood that he was being offered something far more valuable than any monetary reward. He was being inducted into a relationship of mutual respect and obligation that would transcend the normal hostilities between Apache and white settlers. Nature was offering him the protection and friendship of one of the most powerful war chiefs in the territory, a connection that could prove invaluable in the dangerous years ahead. "I ask for no payment except the knowledge that she will grow up healthy and strong," McKenna replied. "A child's life is beyond price, and saving it was reward enough for any effort required." As little Ayana continued to recover through the night, McKenna found himself engaged in conversations with Nate and the Apache healers that revealed the depth of their knowledge and the sophistication of their culture. These were not the savage warriors depicted in newspaper stories and army reports, but intelligent people with rich traditions and deep understanding of the natural world around them. The Apache healers were particularly interested in learning about white medical practices, asking detailed questions about the composition and effects of various medicines. They shared their own knowledge in return, describing herbal remedies and healing techniques that had been developed over centuries of careful observation and experimentation. McKenna realized that he was witnessing an exchange of medical knowledge that could benefit both cultures if the political barriers between them could ever be overcome. As dawn approached, little Ayana woke naturally from healthy sleep and asked for food in a clear voice that brought tears of joy to her grandfather's eyes. The crisis had passed, and the child who had been close to death just hours before was now well on her way to complete recovery. Nate stood and faced McKenna with the formal dignity of an Apache leader conducting important business. "Samuel McKenna," he said, using the rancher's full name with ceremonial precision, "you have proven yourself to be a man of honor and courage. From this day forward, you and all who belong to your household are under the protection of Nate and his warriors. Any Apache who brings harm to you or yours will answer to me personally." The declaration carried enormous significance in the complex world of territorial politics. McKenna was now formally allied with one of the most powerful Apache leaders, a relationship that would provide protection, but might also create complications with military and civilian authorities who viewed any cooperation with Apache leaders as potential treason. But as McKenna looked down at little Ayana, now sitting up and smiling as she ate her first solid food in days, he knew that he would not change anything about the choices he had made. Some decisions were right regardless of their consequences, and saving a child's life was definitely one of those decisions. The sun was fully up when the war party prepared to escort McKenna back to his ranch. Little Ayana was well enough to travel, and Nate wanted to reunite her with her mother and aunt as quickly as possible. The journey back through the mountains took on a celebratory atmosphere as word of the child's recovery spread among the Apache warriors, who had been as concerned about their war chief's granddaughter as their own families would have been. As they approached McKenna's ranch, they could see riders in the distance. A cavalry patrol was approaching from the direction of town, drawn perhaps by reports of unusual activity in the area. McKenna felt his stomach clench as he realized that the complicated situation he had been navigating was about to become even more complex. But Nate seemed unconcerned about the approaching soldiers. He rode with the confidence of a man who held all the important cards in whatever game was about to be played. As the two groups converged on McKenna's ranch, the rancher realized that he was about to witness something that would be talked about throughout the territory for years to come. The meeting between Nate's war party and the cavalry patrol marked the beginning of a new chapter in the relationship between the Apache Nation and the white settlers of Arizona Territory. What had started as one man's simple act of kindness toward strangers in distress had evolved into something much larger and more significant than anyone could have predicted. As McKenna dismounted from his Apache pony in front of his own ranch house, with Thunder waiting in the corral and little Ayana laughing in her grandfather's arms, he understood that he had participated in something truly extraordinary. He had not only saved a child's life, but had also created a bridge between two cultures that had seemed permanently separated by conflict and mistrust. The consequences of that bridge would unfold in the months and years ahead, but for now it was enough to know that a little girl who had been dying was alive, and that sometimes the simple act of doing what was right could change the world in ways that no one could have imagined.